To linguistics and grammatology, writing is nothing but the representation of speech. It is bizarre that one gives more care to the determining of the image than to the object. J.J. Rousseau, fragment in edit d'un essai sur les langues. The concept of writing should define the field of a science. But can it be determined by scholars outside of all the historico-metaphysical predeterminations that we have just situated so clinically? What can a science of writing begin to signify, if it is granted? 1. That the very idea of science was born in a certain epoch of writing. 2. That it was thought and formulated, as task, idea, project, in a language implying a certain kind of structurally and axiologically determined relationship between speech and writing. 3. That, to that extent, it was first related to the concept and the adventure of phonetic writing, valorized as the telos of all writing, even though what was always the exemplary model of scientificity, mathematics, constantly moved away from that goal. 4. That the strictest notion of a general science of writing was born, for non-fortuitous reasons, during a certain period of the world's history, beginning around the 18th century, and within a certain determined system of relationships between living speech and inscription. 5. That writing is not only an auxiliary means in the service of science and possibly its object, but first, as Husserl in particular pointed out in The Origin of Geometry, the condition of the possibility of ideal objects and therefore of scientific objectivity. Before being its object, writing is the condition of the episteme. 6. That historicity itself is tied to the possibility of writing, to the possibility of writing in general, beyond those particular forms of writing in the name of which we have long spoken of peoples without writing and without history. Before being the object of a history of an historical science, writing opens the field of history of historical becoming. And the former, history in German, presupposes the latter, Geschichte. The science of writing should therefore look for its object the roots of scientificity. The history of writing should come back toward the origin of historicity. A science of the possibility of science. A science of science 28 Part I, writing before the letter which would no longer have the form of logic but that of grammatics. A history of the possibility of history which would no longer be an archaeology, a philosophy of history or a history of philosophy. The positive and the classical sciences of writing are obliged to repress this sort of question. Up to a certain point, such repression is even necessary to the progress of positive investigation. Beside the fact that it would still be held within a philosophizing logic, the ontophenomenological question of essence, that is to say of the origin of writing, could, by itself, only paralyze or sterilize the typological or historical research of facts. My intention, therefore, is not to weigh that prejudicial question, that dry, necessary, and somewhat facile question of right, against the power and efficacy of the positive researches which we may witness today. The genesis and system of scripts had never led to such profound, extended, and assured explorations. It is not really a matter of weighing the question against the importance of the discovery, since the questions are imponderable, they cannot be weighed. If the issue is not quite that, it is perhaps because its repression has real consequences in the very content of the researches that, in the present case and in a privileged way, are always arranged around problems of definition and beginning. The grammatologist least of all can avoid questioning himself about the essence of his object in the form of a question of origin. What is writing? Means where and when does writing begin? The responses generally come very quickly. They circulate within concepts that are seldom criticized and move within evidence which always seems self-evident. It is around these responses that a typology of and a perspective on the growth of writing are always organized. All works dealing with the history of writing are composed along the same lines. A philosophical and teleological classification exhausts the critical problems in a few pages. One passes next to an exposition of facts. We have a contrast between the theoretical fragility of the reconstructions and the historical, archaeological, ethnological, philosophical wealth of information. The question of the origin of writing and the question of the origin of language are difficult to separate. Grammatologists, who are generally by training historians, epigraphists, and archaeologists, seldom relate their researches to the modem science of language. It is all the more surprising that, among the sciences of man, linguistics is the one science whose scientificity is given as an example with a zealous and insistent unanimity. Has grammatology, then, the right to expect from linguistics an essential assistance that it has almost never looked for? On the contrary, does one not find efficaciously at work, in the very movement by which linguistics is instituted as a science, a metaphysical presupposition about the relationship between speech and writing? Would that presupposition not hinder the constitution of a general science of writing? Is not the lifting of linguistics and grammatology that presupposition an overthrowing of the landscape upon which the science of language is peacefully installed? For better and for worse? For blindness as well as for productivity? This is the second type of question that I now wish to outline. To develop this question, I should like to approach, as a privileged example, the project and texts of Ferdinand de Saussure. That the particularity of the example does not interfere with the generality of my argument is a point which I shall occasionally try not merely to take for granted. Linguistics thus wishes to be the science of language. Let us set aside all the implicit decisions that have established such a project and all the questions about its own origin that the fecundity of the science allows to remain dormant. Let us first simply consider that the scientificity of that science is often acknowledged because of its phonological foundations. Phonology, it is often said today, communicates its scientificity to linguistics, which in turn serves as the epistemological model for all the sciences of man. Since the deliberate and systematic phonological orientation of linguistics, Trubetskoy, Jacobson, Martin et, carries out an intention which was originally Saussure's, I shall, at least provisionally, confine myself to the latter. Till my argument be equally applicable a fortiori to the most accentuated forms of phonologism. The problem will at least be stated. The science of linguistics determines language its field of objectivity in the last instance and in the irreducible simplicity of its essence, as the unity of the phone, the glossa, and the logos. This determination is by rights anterior to all the eventual differentiations that could arise within the systems of terminology of the different schools, language/speech, langue/parole, code/message, scheme/usage, linguistics/logic, phonology/phonomatic/phonetics/glossomatics. And even if one wished to keep sonority on the side of the sensible and contingent signifier, which would be strictly speaking impossible, since formal identities isolated within a sensible mass are already idealities that are not purely sensible, it would have to be admitted that the immediate and privileged unity which founds significance and the acts of language is the articulated unity of sound and sense within the phony. With regard to this unity, writing would always be derivative, accidental, particular, exterior, doubling the signifier, phonetic. Sign of a sign, said Aristotle, Rousseau, and Hegel. Yet, the intention that institutes general linguistics as a science remains in this respect within a contradiction. Its declared purpose indeed confirms, saying what goes without saying, the subordination of grammatology, the historico-metaphysical reduction of writing to the rank of an instrument enslaved to a full and originarily spoken language. But another gesture, not another statement of purpose, for here what does not go without saying is done without being said, written without being 30 part I, writing before the letter uttered, liberates the future of a general grammatology of which linguistics phonology would be only a dependent and circumscribed area. Let WJ follow this tension between gesture and S statement in sauce sure.